Today's daf is daf Kuf Yud Beis, and we start with the fourth line down from the top. Ba minei Rav Dimi Rav Nachman. So we've been talking now about Basar B'Cholov, and Rav Dimi asks Rav Nachman the following question: Ma'u lanuche kada de milcha? We're talking about malicha, and we're talking about having the salt in such a place, gabikada de chamcha. Now, chamcha is kutach. So we've used the word kutach quite often, and it refers to some sort of a mixture of yogurt and salt and so forth and so on. So he leaves the salt right next to this kada. Kada is a barrel of kamcha, of kutach. Now, what we're afraid is that maybe some of the kutach would spill over into the bag of salt, and the salt is now designated for malicha, for salting the meat. So you don't want to use salt that has absorbed the taste of kutach, of milchiks. Amalei asur. So the response that he got from Rav Nachman was lechumra, that we really have to be careful about this. And the salt that's designated for malichas basar should not be in close proximity to the kutach, which is right next door, because the salt might receive some of the kutach. This would be relevant, for example, if you have, let's say, a milk container. So and you have fleishiks next to a milk container or something that's going to be used for fleishiks. So you got to make sure that the milchiks are closed. They shouldn't be open. Now Rav Dimi asks Rav Nachman a second question. The chalamai. We saw yesterday that the word chala means vinegar. Amalei shari. You're allowed to place the vinegar next to the kutach, even though the vinegar is usually designated to be added to fleishiks. We're not afraid that the kutach would have spilled over into the vinegar. Maishno, what's the difference? So now the Gemara uses a comment which Rav Nachman often throughout Shas uses, kind of a shtach. He says to him, "L'chiteichel alei kura de milcha." If you serve me like a servant serves his master, and you measure out a whole core of salt, which is a large amount. A core is 30 saw. And basically this is Rav Nachman saying, pay me up and do me a major service before I give you an answer. Hi, ise isure biene, v'hai lesa isure biene. So first let's translate the words of the Gemara, and then we'll try to understand them. Rav Nachman is differentiating between the kutach, if it falls into the salt that he's going to use to salt the meat, as opposed to the kutach that might theoretically pour over into the vinegar that he's using to add to his meat dish. And the differentiation is as follows, that in the case of kutach with salt, then the salt doesn't really absorb the kutach, but rather the kutach remains separate from the salt. And therefore you cannot apply the principle of bitul, because isura be'ene and bitul are two mutually exclusive concepts. We'll explain it further with regard to vinegar, and then we'll understand the case of salt. If kutach falls into vinegar, let's say the container of kutach spills over into the vinegar, which is contiguous, it's right next door, then that's called lo be'ine. That somehow the kutach is absorbed into the vinegar. You can't identify it. And that allows you to apply the principle of bittul. You can never apply bittul when you identify the iser. The iser here is the kutach, the milchiks. But in the case of salt, there we have a problem because since the kutach still remains separate as a separate entity from the salt, and the salt is not capable of completely absorbing the kutach, therefore the kutach in the salt is not batel. And if it's not batel because it's identifiable, then you have kutach now in the salt, which you're using to salt meat, and that's basar b'cholah. Let's also add to this discussion what we mentioned yesterday, the principle of moliach hareu kiroseach. That's Shmuel's principle, that salting is almost like heating up. So it's not like, you have cold salt with kutach absorbed into it that's now coming in contact with meat, but that the whole mixture is heated up. Now the Gemara tells the following story. Hu bar gozla denofal lekada de chamra. So they shechted some bird, a pigeon, and it fell into a jug of kutach. The bird is fleshix and the kutach is milchix. And yet, surprise of surprises, they sent the shaila to Rabbi Chanina, and Sharia Rav Chanina Breda Rava Parshona, and Rav Chanina paskin that it's mutter. In other words, even though the kutach has a mixture of not only milchix, meaning yogurt, but it's also very salty, and Shmuel holds that moliach hareu kiroseach, it's like as if it was heated up together. How then could Rav Chanina possibly allow you to eat the meat of the pigeon? Apparently, he held that the pigeon did not absorb the taste of the kutach. And Omar Rav was very surprised that Rav Chanina was matir, meaning that he had plates. You know what the word plates means? That's in Yiddish, he has shoulder blades, meaning he had the, so to speak, the audacity or the self-confidence, let's call it, to be matir something that would seem to be awesome. Man chakim lemishrei ki hai gavna ilav Rav Chanina breder Rav. No one would have the wisdom and the places, as we said before, to be matir such a thing, other than Rav Chanina. We need someone on that high level of Rav Chanina to come up with a permissibility. Kasavar, what is Rav Chanina standing on? What is his underlying reasoning for that ruling Lakula? Ki Amar Shmuel, when did Shmuel apply the principle of Moliach Hareu Kiroseach? Salting is like something hot. That's Hanimili only Hecha di Eno Nechal Machmas Milcha. Wow. This throws in a whole new monkey wrench. It's not that Shmuel meant to say that salting ipso facto is always considered like roseach, like it's hot, but only if there's so much salting that you can't even eat it. It's so salted. It's overly salted. The salt is so powerful. Aval hai kuscha, but when they mix salt into this yogurt and they concoct this, what's it called? Kutach. Harei nechal machmas molcha. Obviously, they're eating the kutach. It's like almost a delicacy. So obviously, there's not so much salt that you can't eat it. It's inedible because of its salt. And in such a case, we don't apply the principle of moliach hareu kirosea. Now, if you take Rav Chinina's ruling to its logical conclusion and apply it without any limitation, and that's what Rava seems to have done, then you might come to the conclusion that even if you took this meat, in this case, this young pigeon that was shechted, and you cooked it or you roasted it, and now it fell into kutach or kutach fell into it, that you simply could eat the pigeon. Maybe just rinse it off from the kutach, because you don't want to put milchiks and fleishiks in your mouth at the same time. But that's about it. So the Gemara says, no, no, no. Let's qualify and restrict that lenient ruling of Rav Chinina. Hani mili chai. After he shechted the young pigeon and it was still raw meat, he hadn't cooked it or roasted it yet, and it fell into the kutach, then we could say that since the kutach doesn't have that extra volume of salt, therefore it's mutter. Just rinse it off. Aval tzli, if the pigeon had already been roasted and then it fell into kutach, then even Rav Chinina would have to concede that boy klipa. Now, klipa is one step above, if you call it lechumra. I mean, it's more strict than hadacha. Hadacha means rinse it off in cold water. And the Gemara is saying that's not sufficient in the case of tzli, of the raw pigeon, the pigeon that was roasted. But now you need klipa. You have to peel off a part of the meat, like the surface level of the meat. That's called klipa. And now we go even beyond that, lechumra. Because let's say it was not just roasted and it's smooth, but rather ispe pile. Now, if you look at the meat after it's roasting, you'll see that it has crevices in it. And then the kutach will penetrate into those crevices, then kule asu. The entire piece of meat has to be discarded, which I believe means you can't even feed it to a dog or sell it to a guy. It becomes like basa b'chola. Now I'll give you, says the Gemara, another scenario in which you have to throw out the meat, which would apply even if, let's say, the meat has none of these cracks after it was roasted. Imitabel betavlin kuleosa. He takes spices and he seasons the meat with spices. And by doing so, even though it doesn't have those cracks and crevices that we spoke about, nevertheless, what happens is the spices soften up the meat, and the meat now becomes absorbent, and now the milchiks of the kutach now is absorbed through the entire piece of meat that was seasoned with tavlinin, and it's awesome. So let's just summarize the bottom line. We've got now the first level would be if, let's say, it was overly salted, that would be asur, even according to Rav Chinina. If it was roasted and it has cracks and crevices in it, and the kutach falls in, that would also be totally prohibited. If it was seasoned with tavlinim, with spices, then all of it is asur. And therefore, the only time that we can apply the kula of Rav Chinina, in which he claims that since it's nechal machmas molcho, and the kutach is edible, and there's only a limited amount of salt, therefore when it falls into the pigeon, you can eat the pigeon meat. That's only if it's raw and it hasn't been overly salted. Omer of Nachman, Omer Shmuel, Kikar shechatach oleha basar. So now we get to a sugya of what we call fleshika meat. I'm sorry, all meat is fleshika. Fleshika bread. Fleshika bread is a problem. But not only that, even if he didn't bake the dough of the bread with meat inside of it, but let's say he has a piece of meat and he salts it. He does malicha to remove the dam. Now he takes that meat and he slices it on top of a loaf of bread. What happens now is that by virtue of slicing a piece of meat that was salted, the dam is still coming out of that meat, and the dam falls on top of the loaf of bread. And therefore you can't eat the bread. That's what Rav Nachman says in the name of Shmuel. Now, we know that malicha, salting meat, has the goal of removing its dam. Shmuel, on the other hand, is saying that even after you salted the meat, there's still some residue of dam that's within the flesh, the body of the meat. And that residue of dam will come down and drip down when he slices the meat. So slicing the meat on top of a loaf of bread is not a good idea. Now the Gemara is going to limit, it's like the flip side of the previous sugya, limit that stringent ruling of Rav Nachman. Hani mili di asmik. Now the word sumka means red. And now we're talking about a case, according to Rashi at least, that the animal, before it was shechted, had some sort of a bruise. Like, I guess you'd call it like a black and blue mark. It's not a treifa. And therefore, because of this bruise, there's blood of the animal that is absorbed within the blood vessels in such a way that if you salt the meat after shechita, then Shmuel is saying that you don't remove all the dam. And not only that, hani mili di avre. Apparently, the Gemara is of the opinion that you could look at the dropping of the blood onto the loaf, and with your eyes, you could determine whether or not that blood was absorbed into the loaf. And that's called the avre, meaning all the blood is now gone, so to speak. You don't see it. It's all inside the loaf of bread. If not, then the dam apparently got held back or stuck on top of the bread. Just clear it off. Then you could eat the bread. Now the Gemara differentiates between that liquid dam that comes out of the meat that he cut on top of the bread. Hani militi asmeche. Asmeche miloshon smichus means samuch. Samuch, even in modern Hebrew, means it's very thick. Aval klishta, klishta means it's weak or thin. Leslan ba. We're not concerned about it. So the underlying reason of the Gemara seems to be that if the texture of this red blood, so the color we said is red, and it comes from that bruise that the animal had during its lifetime. And now we're talking about the texture, not the color, is thick. Since it's thick blood, it penetrates and it's absorbed in the bread. But when you have like a thin, light colored, it's called sear in Hebrew, blood, then we assume that it sort of rolls off the top of the bread of the loaf. So you just peel it away and you could eat the bread. Mara tells the following story. Shmuel Shodile lekalbe. After they cut this bread, I'm sorry, after they cut this meat on top of the bread, Shmuel took that bread and he threw it to the dogs. So apparently what we see from Shmuel is that even when the blood comes from the meat into the loaf of bread, and you're not allowed to eat that loaf of bread because it's absorbed with dam, but nevertheless, there's no Iser Hanoah here. It's not Basa B'cholov, it's dam. Dam is mutar b'hanoah, so he could feed it to his dog. Rav Huna Yorav Le'Lishame. Now this is a pella. Rav Huna took this loaf of bread and he fed it to his attendants. Frek the Gemara Mimonavshach. Ishari, if Rav Huna held against Shmuel, that it's mutter, and we don't have to worry about the fact that the cut meat on top of the bread caused the bread to be absorbed with dam. So then, L'kuli Amashari, why didn't Rav Huna eat the bread? He refused to eat the bread, but he gave it to his Heisbacher to eat the bread. If on the other hand he accepted Shmuel, then L'kuli Alma also. For everyone it's also. How could he feed it to his attendant? And the Gemara answers that, you know what? In fact, Rav Huna rejected Shmuel and he held that the loaf of bread is mutter. Otherwise, he wouldn't have fed it to his attendant. But shiny Rav Huna, why didn't he eat it himself? The anina daite. He's what you call an istidis. And he couldn't get himself to eat it because he found it repulsive. That's what an istidis is. He's very sensitive to, like, for example, again, I'm not equating the two, but something falls on the floor, like a vegetable, a fruit, I don't know what. Cooked food falls on the floor, or let's say you have a piece of cake that falls on the floor. So what do you do with it? So we have the 2-minute rule. If you pick it up within the first 2 minutes, then you could eat it, or you rinse it off if you can rinse. But there's certain people who won't even look at it. That's called an istidis. That's Rav Huna. So the fact that some of the blood fell onto the loaf of bread made it repulsive for Rav Huna, and at his disposition, he was so delicate of a person, he couldn't get himself to eat it. Rava achile. Apparently, Rava held that after the malicha of this piece of meat, the blood that's left over that could fall onto the loaf of bread after he cuts the meat is only that thin blood that we spoke about, which will roll off the top of the loaf of bread. And therefore Rava ate the loaf of bread. V'karile, and when you asked him about the red, liquid that fell onto the piece of meat, he called it chamar basa. Chamar is wine. Chamra is wine. He called it the wine of the meat, meaning, it's just thin liquid. That's all it is. It's not really dam. By the way, it seems like Rava didn't even bother testing to see, how dark was the red color of the dam here that fell. Rava said, I don't even have to check that out. This is the juice of the meat. It's not real dam. And regardless of its color or texture, it's meat juice. It's not dam. And therefore you could eat the loaf of bread. Rav Nachman Omer Shmuel ein menichim kli tachas basar. Okay, so now we get back to the sugya of Barduga. Do you remember they had this minhag that when they roasted the meat, they put a receptacle underneath the rotary, or what's it called, rotisserie, whatever it's called, in order to collect the fat. So Rav Nachman is against this whole thing. Why? Because Rav Nachman, in the name of Shmuel, said that even after you roast a piece of meat, there still is dam, some residue of dam that's inside the meat. And now what's going to happen is you put this bardugi or whatever it's called underneath and it collects the fat, but now there's dam coming down, mixing with the fat. Until that liquid that comes out of the meat is no longer red. And then it's just meat wine, as we said before. Minoya Dina. Is there a way of, give me a gauge? How do I determine that there's no problem with this dam that's coming out? Now, when I first learned this Gemara, I thought Rav Papa was like joking with us. Not joking with us, but he was using like a simile, a metaphor, like the Gemara says that if you have, something of Hegdesh that has to be burnt on the Mizbeach, at what point do you say the mitzvah was completed? When it's Talit Timraso, when the pillar of smoke goes up to the air. But no, Rashi says this is not some sort of a proverbial phrase, but he's referring to roasting a piece of meat. And during the procedure, what happens is like smoke comes out of the meat. Like when we do a grill here, I always assume that the smoke is coming from the coals. What I never knew was that the smoke is coming out of the meat itself. And once the smoke rises from the meat, we know that all the dam was taken out. However, Rashi offers a second shot, which is a little bit closer to my intuition. And he says that the smoke begins to rise from the coals beneath the meat. And at that point, when the smoke arises from the coals, you know that they're really, really hot. And any dam that would come from the meat that's on the spit would go down and be burnt up by the coals. Maskif la Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi now raises the following objection: V'dilma tata mota ila lo mota. What are you telling me? That the smoke is rising, so that means that all the dam is coming, has already been exuded from the meat. That's not so. Maybe that smoke is coming from the bottom of the meat, but yet on the top part of the meat, there's still dam. And therefore, Rav Ashi rejects this way of trying to determine if the dam is completely out. Ella, Amar Rav Ashi substitutes, Lesle Takanta, Forget about this Beidugi receptacle. Just, you know, there's no solution. Elamishta Bei Tarte Galili Milcha. The only thing you could possibly do after this Beidulga has received the fat that drips down from the meat that's roasting on the spit is you can add to this fat that's in the Beidugi, add a lump, two lumps of salt. And now what happens is the fat and the blood separate one from the other. And what happens is that the blood goes down to the bottom of the Beidugi and the fat floats on top. So all you have to do now is skim off the fat and you can eat it. It's not mixed together with the dam.